The first sign was the silence. Not the ceremonial kind, the hush before a bride walks down the aisle, or the reverent pause as vows are exchanged, but a silence too empty to belong in a room full of love. A silence that swelled like a bruise. I stood at the back of the grand chapel, my father's arm looped around mine, staring down the long ivory carpet that led to the altar. The guests had risen. The music played, but Marcus wasn't there. There was no whisper from the officiant, no nervous shifting from the groomsmen. Just stillness. And the clock above the archway kept ticking, louder with each second he failed to appear. If you're drawn into Elena's story of betrayal and revenge, make sure to like this chapter and subscribe for the next 4 parts. The reckoning is just beginning. At first, I assumed something small had gone wrong. A cufflink, a lost ring, a sudden headache. Something that could be soothed and forgotten. But when the minutes passed, 5, then 10, then 20, and no one could reach him, the stillness cracked into confusion. My father whispered questions into his phone. My maid of honor, Serena, fidgeted with her bouquet, avoiding my gaze. And I, swaddled in white satin and a veil hand-sewn by my mother, stood still as a statue in a dream I hadn't chosen. Eventually, someone from Marcus's side, the best man, I think, stepped up to the officiant and whispered something. The officiant's expression didn't change. That was the worst part. He simply nodded, stepped forward, and gently announced to our sea of loved ones that the ceremony was postponed. Postponed. A word that has the dignity of rescheduling and the devastation of rejection. I remember very little after that. I remember Serena's hand on my arm, her voice in my ear saying, "Let's get you out of here." I remember flashes of pity from people I had known since childhood. And I remember the floral scent of peonies, my favorite flower, chosen for their meaning, healing, honor, romance. What irony! Back in the bridal suite, I sat in front of the mirror still in my dress, the veil like a shroud. My phone buzzed over and over with condolences and questions. But Marcus didn't call.
He didn't text.
No note, no explanation. Just absence. And then the rage began. Not loud, not flailing, just a slow, simmering clarity. A realization that something deeper than fear or cold feet had led to this moment. That his disappearance wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. And if Marcus thought leaving me at the altar would be the end of our story, he had badly miscalculated. Because I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to rise. And when I did, everyone would hear the sound. The first rumor came 2 days after the wedding that wasn't. My cousin Ava, never one for subtlety, texted me a screenshot of an Instagram story. It showed Serena, my best friend since college, my maid of honor, on a beach I didn't recognize, wearing a white silk cover-up that looked hauntingly like my honeymoon robe. Her caption, "Sunset with my favorite person."
No tags. No faces.
Just her voice behind the camera, soft and laughing, cooing to someone off-screen. Someone who sounded like Marcus. At first, I told myself it couldn't be. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old video. Maybe it was a coincidence. But the more I dug, the less plausible that became. My hands shook as I clicked through her posts. A champagne glass clinked in a story from the same day we should have been boarding a flight to Santorini. A man's watch, too familiar to mistake, glinted in the corner of one frame. My heart knew before my head would admit it. They were together. Somewhere far from the wreckage they left behind.
I didn't cry.
I didn't scream. I saved everything. I scrolled through months of digital breadcrumbs, messages, photos, timestamps. I remembered the time Serena had insisted on helping Marcus choose my engagement ring, how she knew my ring size without asking. I remembered the nights she canceled on our girls' dinners last minute, claiming work emergencies that now reeked of lies. And I remembered Marcus's sudden shift in tone a month before the wedding. How he became distant, preoccupied, always on a call, or just tired. The betrayal unfolded like a blueprint. Cold. Clinical.
And devastating.
It wasn't just infidelity. That would have been painful enough. This was strategic. Marcus had been using me to elevate his status into my family's company, my father's good graces, the social circles that had previously shut him out. And Serena had helped him. She knew our secrets, our structure, the vulnerabilities of my family's investments. And they'd planned to extract what they could before walking away. Only Marcus didn't walk. He fled. A coward who couldn't face the fire he lit. By the end of that week, I knew. I knew everything. The affair. The manipulation. The fraud. My father was already seeing the financial inconsistencies Marcus had introduced in the name of consulting. My brother discovered falsified invoices, backdated contracts, some of them with Serena's name buried deep in the paper trail. They didn't just leave me. They tried to destroy me. But I wasn't going to warn them. I wanted them to feel safe.
Smug.
Victorious. Because when my revenge arrived, it would not come quietly. The first thing I did was cut my hair. Not in some symbolic act of mourning or renewal. No. I wanted a weapon. Something clean.
Sharp.
A visual cue that said, I am not the girl you left behind. The long curls Marcus once traced with his fingers in moments of false tenderness were gone. In their place, a sleek, angular bob that framed my face like the edge of a blade. I didn't cry in the salon chair. I looked myself in the mirror and said nothing. There was no need. The woman staring back at me was someone I hadn't met yet, but she had plans. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted precision. The reinvention wasn't just about appearance. I dove headfirst into the data. I pulled bank statements, read corporate bylaws, sat for hours with my father's CFO, who was only too happy to walk me through what Marcus had tried to do. In truth, I'd never cared much for the family business before, preferring literature to ledgers, art to accounts.
But now?
Now I studied every contract, every signature, every dollar Marcus had touched. I learned how to trace shell companies. I learned how to audit a fraud from the inside out. And most importantly, I learned how to make it public. By the end of the month, I was no longer the heartbroken bride hiding in her apartment. I was showing up. In meetings. At luncheons. At events Marcus had once used to climb his way up. But now, instead of being his plus one, I was the keynote speaker. I spoke about resilience, about ethics in family enterprise, about protecting legacies. I smiled with just enough softness to keep people leaning in, and just enough steel to make sure they never underestimated me again. Meanwhile, I fed small truths to the right people. A journalist friend with a taste for scandal received an anonymous dossier filled with carefully curated receipts. A quiet conversation with Serena's boss led to a compliance audit. I didn't have to scream to be heard. I just had to plant seeds. Seeds that would grow into headlines, into firings, into legal reviews. Serena posted less. Marcus was rarely seen in public. And I was blooming. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Revenge isn't real until the whole room sees it. Until the ones who betrayed you are made to face what they tried to bury. I needed a stage big enough for all of it. One final, public act that no one would forget. The perfect opportunity came dressed in black tie, the annual Langston Foundation Gala. The same gala Marcus once begged to attend as my guest. The one where my family's name was etched into the marble wall. He would be there.
So would she.
And I would walk in, not as a guest, but as a storm. The Langston Foundation Gala was a cathedral of opulence. Gold-trimmed invitations. Champagne towers. Music that whispered money. Held at the glass house overlooking the river, it was a monument to wealth and legacy. Exactly the kind of room Marcus had always craved, the kind he thought he could only enter on my arm. This time, he arrived on Serena's. Their entrance was a calculated performance. She in a crimson silk gown, he in a midnight tux, his hand curved around her waist like a claim. They smiled like they'd won. Like no one remembered the mess they left behind. But I hadn't come to be remembered. I came to make them unforgettable for all the right reasons. My entrance was timed to the second. When the MC announced the start of the formal program, I stepped into the spotlight. I wore black, not mourning, but authority, and spoke with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I was introduced not as a jilted bride or a family ornament, but as the new director of ethics and compliance for our global holdings. My speech, a poised, elegant address on the importance of trust in partnerships. And then, with the entire room watching, I opened a velvet folder. Unfortunately, I said, pausing for effect, our company recently experienced a breach of that trust. What follows is not gossip, it's documentation. A screen behind me flickered to life. What played next wasn't dramatic. No photos of cheating, no emotional pleas. Just spreadsheets, emails, voicemails, bank transfers. A quiet, brutal avalanche of facts. I spoke over the visuals with surgical calm, detailing how Marcus and Serena had collaborated to defraud multiple divisions under our company's umbrella. I named names. I quoted numbers. I showed contracts with forged initials and money wired to untraceable shell corporations. People gasped. Some turned away. Others leaned in closer. Marcus didn't move. Serena went pale, the color draining from her face like ink in water. I ended with one final slide, an arrest warrant, quietly issued hours earlier, for both of them, pending formal charges. The room exploded in a mix of silence and murmurs, and I stood there unflinching as the applause began.
Slow.
Reluctant, then rising, rippling like thunder through the crowd. Security escorted Marcus and Serena out, their elegant costumes crumpling under the weight of truth. They didn't shout.
They didn't resist.
Because they knew this wasn't just revenge. It was a reckoning. In the weeks that followed the gala, headlines did what they do best. They spread. Betrayal at the altar becomes corporate scandal. Heiress exposes ex-fiancé and former best friend at Gala showdown. From veil to verdict, Elena Rowan's rise. My name, once whispered in sympathy, now carried weight. Not because of the betrayal, but because of the aftermath. Because I hadn't hidden. I had spoken, calculated, conquered. Marcus lost everything. The consulting firm that once praised him for his ambitions severed ties before the ink on the articles dried. Serena was fired within days, her license under review for falsified compliance documents. Legal proceedings loomed, and I made sure every step was handled by the book. I didn't need to embellish their crimes. The truth was enough to bury them. And still, I didn't gloat. That was the part that seemed to confuse people the most. There were no dramatic interviews, no revenge-fueled tell-alls. I declined morning shows. I refused gossip columns. Instead, I launched a foundation. One focused on empowering women in business, especially those whose trust had been exploited in personal or professional relationships. The name of the initiative? The Vow Project. Because promises matter, and when they're broken, justice matters more. Strangers began reaching out. Not with pity, but with gratitude. Women who had been conned, silenced, abandoned. They saw themselves in my story, not in the wealth, not in the setting, but in the silence they'd endured. They told me my calm had spoken louder than their screams, that my revenge had reminded them they were still allowed to rise. I rebuilt my life not as a reaction, but as a declaration. Not just that I had survived, but that I had become someone no one could dismantle again. The chapel where I was left standing? My family donated it to a community arts center. The peonies I once couldn't bear to smell? I had them planted in the courtyard outside my office, blooming fiercely in full sunlight. And the dress I had worn on that day, the symbol of everything lost, I had it framed and hung not as a memorial, but as a marker. Of what I overcame, of what I refused to become. One day, perhaps, Marcus will walk past a bookstore and see my name on a spine. Or Serena will scroll through an awards list and see mine above hers. Or maybe, just maybe, they'll hear applause in a room they aren't allowed to enter and know I'm behind it. And when that moment comes, I hope they finally understand. The vows they broke weren't the end of me. They were the making. If this story struck a chord, if you've ever dreamed of reclaiming your voice and turning betrayal into power, like this story and subscribe for more tales of revenge, reinvention, and the calm before the storm. Your power begins the moment you decide the silence ends.